Lord of the Rings trilogy is the best trilogy ever made. Now, let me explain why. I just finished watching the first one, The Fellowship of the Ring, last night actually, and it spawned this idea that this really is the best trilogy of all time. And it was kind of a weird thought because I feel like a lot of the times you don't really think about things in terms of, is this really the best? Is this better than anything that has ever existed? And because of this, I was kind of taken aback by my own thought, because I was like, well, that's not right. I mean, there's certainly a lot of really great trilogies, right? I mean, you have The Godfather. Well, Godfather 3, we shouldn't even really talk about, so that's out. You have The Dark Knight, but that has its own problems that I'll get into in a second. You have episode 4, 5, and 6 of Star Wars. Well, 6 was kind of weak. I mean, I loved the film, but it took a really different approach than 4 and 5, and it just really didn't feel like a complete whole story. What makes this stand out above all of those? Well, the reason why I've concluded this is because Lord of the Rings has a unique ability to have each individual movie have its own merit and have its own stand on its own. It can stand on its own two legs and be a great part of an individual film by itself. Nothing else is required, while also benefiting and adding to the other two films. And because of those other two films, it is able to create not only individually 3 amazingly done, amazingly filmed, amazingly edited, and amazingly scripted stories, but together it provides one concrete body of work that is consistent across the board, has a consistent feel, has consistent scripting, and is a whole story. See, some of the larger stories, they trick you by having you focus on the details of the now, and the overall narrative is very simple. Lord of the Rings isn't like that. And yes, they are incredibly detailed in the individual characters and in the scenery and in the surrounding world and the lore. And all that stuff has its own microcosms and microcosms of those microcosms that'll add to this really big picture. But the big picture itself is incredibly interesting. Now, there's a term for this type of object in a movie, and I'm not sure what it is. But let's take The Ring, for example. The Ring is something that really isn't heavily explored as to what exactly it actually does. Yet you feel the weight of it throughout the entire movie, and it affects every individual within the movie that comes in close proximity to the ring. Both in obvious ways and not so obvious ways. Like Boromir, for example, is very heavily affected by the ring. Aragorn, not so much. Yes, it's kind of explained that he is somewhat affected, but he doesn't outwardly show it. There's no desire for the ring from him. Nonetheless, it does affect everybody and all the surrounding people. So they have this object that doesn't do anything on its own. It doesn't really represent anything. If it was left alone in a room, it wouldn't go anywhere. It doesn't create any danger by itself. But the one person whose hands it's most dangerous in is the exact place where they need to take it. And it creates a long, drawn-out conflict. And that theme is present and explored throughout the entire trilogy. And it's consistent all across the board. And that never disappears. Now, on top of the story being amazing, and that's partially accredited to the editors who edited the script and J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote the original content. It's one thing to have a technical script be fascinating. It's one thing to say, this is fascinating for this reason. It's a whole nother thing to be able to put that on film, and for Peter Jackson to be able to direct this in a consistent manner throughout and project it on the screen in a way that really makes me immersed as a film buff. I'm a guy who wants to be a future filmmaker, and I pick apart movies to the bone to try and figure out how they did certain shots and why they did certain shots and how they got this and how they did that. But when movies really get me, when I notice the biggest difference in a movie is when I forget to do that, when I am immersed in a world. And there are movies that have done that. The Last Jedi. Now, I'll get to The Last Jedi in a second. But the cinematography of the world, the looks of the world drew me into that. Now, the script and everything else about it threw me back out of that immersion, but the filming really got me. But the filming of The Lord of the Rings, even on a 4K monitor where I'm playing a 1080p video, and it's very obvious that it doesn't hold up to today's CGI standards, I just don't give a shit. I love the movie and I love the feeling that it gives me, including the cinematography, and a huge part to that is Howard Shore's soundtrack for The Lord of the Rings. It's one of the most impressive soundtracks for any movie, rivaling that of Hans Zimmer. And Hans Zimmer, as a whole, as his whole body of work, is up there at the top with everybody else I've ever heard. But Howard Shore's soundtrack, his whole body of work, is not quite at the top, but his work for this is up there. It's really, really impressive. So there's a plethora of reasons why this is a good trilogy, and a big part of that is the detail. Just the other day I found out that Gandalf keeps his pipe and his staff, and I grew up on these movies. I grew up on all three of these, watching them on repeat, and I never even noticed that. And I'm constantly learning stuff about that. I literally learned that last week, not even like 4 days ago. And it's just little details like that that are here and there that make this such a magical experience. Like, it's really, really an impressive film. And there aren't many films that can take me out of being an audience member or a filmmaker and really make me like not care about any faults at all. You know, the whole issue with like, could the Eagles fly Frodo to Mordor and have him destroy the ring and have it be over in 5 minutes? I don't even care that there's that big of a plot hole in it. I know that that's there, and I think about it every time, but I don't care because I love the story. Individually, the movies have every hallmark of what would make a good movie. Good character development, good cinematography, good soundtrack, good CGI for the time, good action, good this, good that, good scripting, good everything. Everything that you could want it to have, it has. It has texture where it needs it. It has fast-paced action where it needs it. It has slow and detailed and really specific dialogue where it needs it. Every hallmark that you would need, each movie has. And not only does it have it as individual movies, but the work together, it fits just like perfect fitting puzzle pieces. It concludes to a whole body of work that is consistent across the board. Now, this is something that I found lacking in another trilogy that I really, really love, and that's the Dark Knight trilogy. See, with the Dark Knight trilogy, each movie had its own feel, and I loved each movie. I really am a huge fan of each movie. I think the Dark Knight was definitely a highlight, given how all the politics came into it and the choices that Batman had to make, and really making him make a moral choice. I think that was incredibly well done. Good job, Christopher Nolan. But the pieces together, Batman Begins, The Dark Knight Rises, hardly consistent at all. And they were not only hardly consistent in storylines, but they didn't really have a general premise to connect them all other than, oh, Batman defends the next bad guy who tries to take over the city. And so as standalone pieces, they do wonderfully. They really do. But as a whole body of work, they don't. And if you're going to judge a trilogy as a trilogy, you have to look at the whole body of work. And that is something that The Lord of the Rings does that no other trilogy to date has been able to do. Star Wars probably coming closest with 4, 5, and 6, but again, 6 was kind of a low point, and it just didn't, the whole movies as a whole didn't draw me in the same way that The Lord of the Rings did. And maybe it was the style of filming, I don't know. Whatever it was, there's something special about The Lord of the Rings. And if you have any thoughts on that, leave it in the comments below. My name is Josh. Thank you very much for watching. And if you haven't checked out my second channel, check it out. Instagram, all that stuff. All the self-promo you could ever want down below. Join the Patreon. Don't forget to join the Patreon. I need patrons because I'm trying to make this a career. So help me out, guys, please. Yeah, stay safe. Don't drown. Don't do anything your mom would approve of. Peace.